Well, let's get rolling. It's 6:11. I appreciate everybody being here. Um, and I think what we want to do, we're going to do a few quick introductions of those of us who've been working together on this issue. And then I'm going to give a short presentation, probably about 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Right now, I want to kick it off to Craig Eichelman. Craig, do you want to? I'm going to screw up your actual title if I try to say it. So introduce yourself.
Thanks, Kevin. Good evening, everybody. I'm Craig Eichelman. I'm the state director in Missouri for AARP. And AARP's had a long history of working on affordable housing issues, but the Missouri office has not. And go back to the 2019 mayoral election, and we fielded a survey of 800 likely voters over the age of 50, and housing affordability was the #1 issue. So we have really sort of scrambled to get connected to folks who are in that space, not recreate the wheel, and put our brand behind working with local leaders to think about housing differently. So I'm glad to be part of this group and look forward to some successes. And we have limited bandwidth to for this, so we've contracted with Public Progress. And Laura Lanaco is who we use, and it's really been our right hand in helping to get this better organized. So I'll turn it over to Laura.
Hey everybody, it's nice to see you tonight. This has been a pleasure to be working with Kevin and Stacy on creating a livability coalition. Like Craig said, it's a pleasure to work with AARP, and what's good for what's good for older residents of Kansas City, we know is also good for families. And so housing choice and affordability is something we've been talking a lot about. I'm going to put in the chat a couple of resources that you can link directly to from AARP. One's called the ABCs of ADUs, so you can learn more. We don't want to flood your inboxes too much because Kevin's going to give you a lot of information. We also have hot topics and from AARP, and also information about livable communities. And so with this process, we've been really trying to be deliberate and hearing from older neighborhoods and neighborhoods all across Kansas City about affordable housing, and making sure that we take people's, when I talk we, I mean all of us on here, take everyone's feedback when the city's examining this really important tool in the toolbox to address the issue of affordable housing and livability. And hopefully this is just the first step in working together. So I'm going to introduce Stacy Johnson Cosby, who I bet most people here know. She's been working on housing issues, and we reached out to her for her connection, particularly with realtors, but also the work that you've been doing, Stacy. So why don't you say a few words and then we'll get started.
Sure, thank you. And I wanted to say thank you to Laura and Kevin for your expertise in the various areas that you have, and inviting us into the process. Us would be my alliance. We are the housing creators. We're housing providers. And so again, my name is Stacy Johnson Cosby. I'm a real estate agent of 34 years. And so I've been selling the city for a long time. Also an investor who happens to be a housing provider or landlord for 20 something years. We have a coalition of investors, realtors, landlords, property managers, all together representing over 100,000 rental units in our area. And so we speak with one voice, and we have created a housing policy proposal to share with the city with our support of creating more housing that is affordable in our cities. And we want to do it responsibly. And that's why we're glad to be a part of this coalition that is not just an ordinance that is forcing something that may not fit in certain neighborhoods, which is why we're doing it this way. We're bringing people together to talk about what you want in your neighborhoods and what you don't want. And our goal is to create something that is collaborative, that when it goes to City Hall, instead of like many times neighborhoods, we come out and fight against things, we want to fight for something and to have people that are on board from the beginning, which is again why we've created and we're building our Livable KC Coalition. So the KC Regional Housing Alliance is happy to be part of it. And we thank you all for being here today. And our goal is to create and preserve housing. And so with that, again, I say welcome.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both. I appreciate it. I'm Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm just a Midtown resident, nothing more, nothing less. Well, maybe a little more, but I'm actually an architect by background and have a fair amount of actual life experience with what some people might call alternative forms of housing. In fact, the first home that I bought was in Mary Jo's neighborhood, and that was actually a triplex that I bought, and which I was able to do when I was a pretty young person, and then later was able to build a home with an ADU that I'll describe in a minute, and then later purchased a separate home that had one. So I've actually owned two properties where I had ADUs, and I'll show you an example of that in this presentation. But I want to go through some basics about ADUs to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what the heck this is. So I'm going to switch over and share my screen right now, and let's make sure this works. Okay, do you all see that full screen? Great. This is sort of looking at just the basics of ADUs. In fact, the cover slide here is an example of, this is one in Denver, where you have the garage apartment behind the house in the back. So as we mentioned early on, we're building this coalition here. This is really a new thing that we've been able to work on successfully with it. AARP's involvement with KC Regional Housing Alliance, with the support here of Midtown KC Now, which is my employer, my day job. And the idea is really to try to find some creative solutions for more housing and better housing and more housing opportunities for Kansas Cityans. We're starting in Kansas City, Missouri, because that's where the three of us live, where we think there's a lot of opportunities and also where there's a lot of need. So we're hopeful that over time that we can help lead the way and help other communities in the region as well think about their housing policies and how they can modernize some of their approaches. So I just have to start and say, yes, ADU is a very strange term. It's kind of a wonky, city planning term. And it's just simply a short version of accessory dwelling unit. You might have heard it named something else. There's a lot of different names for the same thing. You might hear it called a granny flat or a carriage house. You might hear it called a mother-in-law quarters. It's simply the idea of a smaller independent residential dwelling unit that's located on the same lot as a standalone house. So typically in Kansas City, that might be, you'd have a house that faces the street at the front of the lot, and a carriage house or a granny flat in the backyard that's a separate, that's its own independent residential unit. And they typically do have, one of the things that makes the definition of independent is they have their own kitchen. So it is a full living unit. It is not just like a room addition. That's what distinguishes an ADU from, say, just building an extra room onto your house. This is not a newfangled idea here in Kansas City. We've had these around for a long, long time. In fact, if you look at the urban core and include even KCK and the older parts of KCK, there's roughly about 80 square miles of our city that where there are all sorts of existing ADUs that were built 100 years ago. And continue to be used to this day. They're rented. They're used for family members. This was a very common method of providing independent housing 100 years ago and more. You can see the examples in virtually every neighborhood north of, say, 75th Street or probably even 80th Street in Kansas City, Missouri, as well as the older parts of KCK and even some in the older parts of Johnson County, and as well as some of the outlying communities. If you're old enough to remember the TV show Happy Days, you may know that the Fonz lived in an ADU up above the Cunningham's garage. He had his own apartment right up there. Again, so this is not a new idea. It's not something that is unique to us or anywhere else. So I have a few images here to just talk about like why anybody might care about these or who might benefit from ADUs. Straight off the top, there's a great benefit to homeowners. It helps if you have an ADU on your property, it helps provide some extra income. to help offset the costs of the primary mortgage on the house. If you're living in a neighborhood where things are trending better, it helps provide some additional income to offset what is usually an increasing cost of living in those neighborhoods, like increased taxes and other things. It provides, again, for the homeowner, additional income where you can spend in your neighborhood. And it can also be a place to house a friend or a family member, but where you're not actually under the same roof. And I can vouch for that, knowing as one experience when we had our ADU when our children were very young. It was actually nice where family could come visit for a short period of time and we could all get together and share that time together. But then they actually went into their own separate unit in the backyard and we had, our separate space in the house. And it really is a wonderful approach and way to benefit the homeowner. For the renter, it also is, these tend to be much more affordable rents than you might typically see in like a large apartment complex. And the reason that is because this is one of the least expensive ways to actually build housing. Little standalone units like this tend to be the least expensive way to try to add housing supply to an area. Now, I'm not saying they are, I'm not saying these are cheap. I'm not saying that these would be low income because they still do cost something to build and there's a cost that has to be offset. But it's generally what you see is these are much less expensive than a larger apartment building. It's also nice for a renter because it's a different type of living environment. So it really feels more like a neighborhood environment. You're not in a large apartment complex where you're sharing hallways with people. And it's almost, you really almost have like your own little house, which is kind of nice. And then these often are in pretty desirable locations in our community. For the neighborhoods themselves, this is a great way to actually add people to a neighborhood in a way that hardly anybody notices that they're really there. It preserves, especially in our historic neighborhoods, it sort of preserves the historic building pattern where you have still the main house at the front of the lot and something else in the back. So it's an interesting way. We're sometimes talking about how do we add people to our city so that we can help increase the population and recapture population we've lost. This is one way to do it in a way that it's almost kind of invisible. It's really interesting. They do also for the neighborhood tend to raise property values. Obviously that's not, that's a good and a bad thing depending on your perspective. More people in the neighborhood generally provides for more people walking around all times of day, which it actually makes for a safer neighborhood. And if you live in a place where there are local businesses, like many of our older neighborhoods have, again, this is a great way to have more customers, more people around to help support those neighborhood businesses that we all enjoy. So it's interesting. For several years ago, I was fascinated when AARP got involved in this issue. AARP, as Laura and Craig mentioned, they have tremendous resources related to their Livable Communities program. They are really, really first-rate resources. And the links are there in the chat. I'd encourage anybody to take a look at them. And it's really phenomenal that they've gotten involved in these issues because they really can be important for seniors. And so, for example, these might enable a person to stay on their property longer in a different living arrangement. So it could be, not just a room over a garage, but it could be just like a one-story cottage in the backyard that maybe as you get older, you decide you want to rent out the main house and downsize to the smaller cottage in the backyard. That's something that some people do. It's also an option to have rental income when otherwise your income, you might be in a scenario in life where your income is fixed. And that's a really nice feature to have. And we see that these help people stay in their houses longer, which most people as they age still really want to generally stay in their house as long as they possibly can. And it also offers an opportunity for family members, as I mentioned before, to live close to each other, but still have some physical separation. For a local government, this is actually a great way to raise additional revenue because there typically will be a property tax bump that happens with these. It's a way to raise additional revenue without actually raising taxes on people. So it's a substantial you know, I should say it's probably a very modest amount for on a 1 or 2 property basis. But when you have quite a few of these that do it, it's a really nice way for local government and all the local taxing jurisdictions to really benefit from additional activity. So again, I just remind that, you know, these exist all over our city. You will see that some of them are rented and occupied and in use. If you just walk around, bike around, drive around our city, you'll see these. You'll see others that are like this one. This is right around the corner from me that for whatever reason is effectively boarded up and not really used as a rental. It was built as one, but currently not used as one. And there might be a variety of reasons for that. And one reason being that we have some challenges with zoning in Kansas City that make it hard. And I'll describe that in a second. So an ADU can look a few different ways. It could be a converted garage. It could be a purpose-built garage with an apartment above. It might be an attachment on the back of a house, a direct attachment. Could even be a basement conversion in some cases. This is something that is a little more common in Kansas City, especially in the urban core areas. We have, as many of you know, we have a lot of very large 3-story historic homes, especially in the Midtown area of Kansas City. And a lot of those were commonly used where the 3rd floor unit was a separate quarters and it had its own entry off the side of the house. And so you can think of that as almost an ADU if it had its own separate kitchen and access to it on the 3rd floor. So there's some opportunity for that. But really the most common version, I would say easily 70 or 80% of what you see is that detached structure that sits in the backyard that either is its own little 1-story cottage or is somehow tied to a garage. Here's an example of one. I lived in Savannah, Georgia for about 8 years in between my stints here in Midtown in Kansas City. This picture is the picture of the back of a townhouse that we owned. And those structures that you see in the photo are the ADUs that were behind the townhomes. So there's an alley behind those buildings and they access the garage. So the garage parks off the alley. We don't have a lot of alleys in Kansas City, but we have some. We have a few neighborhoods that have them, not very many. But in this case, you had little ADUs that were a 2-car garage, and it had a really nice little 1-bedroom apartment above it of about 450 square feet. And these were really livable units. They were all rented out in different ways to different kinds of people. And I would say, you know, just to be very frank, from our perspective as the homeowners, it was an incredible bonus to us because the rent that we got off the ADU basically paid the mortgage on the house. So we were able to live in a nice place very inexpensively. And which also benefited us when we started having kids. It was much easier for us to live off of one income than it would have been otherwise. So that was one way that, you know, it was a really wonderful addition to our lives. In the last few years, there's been a series of cities that have really worked on legalizing ADUs. In fact, a couple of entire states, California and Oregon, and now I think Washington also, have really pushed through legislation affecting all the communities in those states. But there's been a number of other states or a number of other cities, including some in our region like North Kansas City, that have passed new ordinances to permit and allow ADUs in their community. In Kansas City, Missouri, we have a few quirks that, without getting too deep into the weeds, that, but the reality is they're a real challenge. The way I kind of describe this here is that they're basically only allowed in Kansas City, Missouri, if you're already somebody who has a lot of money and you have a very large lot, like a few places in Central Hyde Park or Roanoke, and they cannot be rented to non-family members. So, you know, that is, for all intents and purposes, an effective ban on new ADUs in the city, even though, again, as I said, many of these exist all over the city. Another interesting quirk of that is most of those neighborhoods also actually allow duplexes. So you can actually build 2 attached units, but you can't build the 2 separated ones like this. So that's really all I wanted to share today from an overview. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Happy to, you know, we've got plenty of time here. We can talk about anything that concerns that you might have, questions that come to mind. You know, what sort of things come to mind when we talk about these, either a positive or a negative thing that you might be concerned about in your neighborhood. And you know, obviously one of the things about Kansas City, Missouri is it's such a large city that we have so many different kinds of neighborhoods, and we want to be careful not to paint everything with the same brush. So curious to hear anybody's questions or comments. I see Diane had a comment in there that it gives a special needs adult a place to be that is close to someone but independent. Yeah, that's definitely true.
I'm interested in the history behind why it's basically not allowed today when it was so common before.
Well, I can help a little bit with that. Donna and others might have better historical knowledge. I can tell you just very 30,000 feet, cities all over the country, when they started adopting zoning ordinances, originally, you know, first in the 1920s, but really in a big way in the 1950s and 60s, when those came into being, they were really adopting a whole new way of thinking about cities, for better or for worse. Some of us might say for worse. But part of what, you know, the adoption of that zoning approaches in the 20th century were, the theory was to space the cities out and make our cities more of a driving cities built around cars and lower density. And unfortunately, in the urban planning world, those ideas were pretty well copied and pasted all over the country. And so zoning ordinances were to put in place that made a lot of the historic pattern actually non-conforming. So that was kind of one broad brush thing. And then certainly in the era when cities went into serious decline, you know, in the 70s and into the 80s, there was a big push on the part of many neighborhoods to downzone, and into the 90s as well. And that's because, you know, and there are people here who know this better than I do, but I would interpret it as, you know, there were just a lot of problems with multifamily properties and rentals in that era, and just terrible slumlords and mismanagement of property. And neighborhoods were fighting for their survival and trying to figure out a way to, you know, to turn the tide. And so downzoning was a common method to do that.
Kevin,
Oh, go ahead, Nola.
I'd just like to comment that we've had a lot of these types of conversations in our area over the last 20 years. A couple of large Christian ministries have moved into and grown in the area. And so a lot of families have, you know, maybe the younger generation moved to Kansas City to be part of a ministry, and then grandma and grandpa wanted to come be with them and be with the grandkids. And so these are very practical ideas that people have actually been doing without it being, you know, officially legal. And so then sometimes you have rather selective enforcement of city rules. You know, some enforcement that you'd like to see doesn't happen on, you know, really obvious glaring things, but then you may have complaints about things that are actually good trends along this line. So I'm really glad to see you advancing these ideas. They're very helpful in a number of different settings.
Thank you.
And then along those lines, I have a question for our neighborhoods. Are there any concerns? And my guess is that by being here, you may have at least maybe some interest. And if not, I'd be curious about that. But do you see any reason for concern amongst your neighbors? Why would someone not be in support of ADUs if they were to be introduced into your neighborhoods? Any ideas or thoughts there?
I can tell you a major problem has been, and it's kind of like when a college moves to your town, that sometimes young people, the first time they've lived away from home, they don't realize that you got to obey the parking rules. Don't park on the grass, don't have 10 cars all around your house taking up all the space. So some of it is consumer education that, you know, there are some rules that you do need to follow. And some of it is just, you know, a little discomfort that comes with growth of population.
Well, I'll say in Valentine, I think our concern would be, and Kevin sort of alluded to this, we're one of the neighborhoods that downzoned in the 1980s, and we really feel like it made a huge difference in the neighborhood in terms of the houses were all broken up during World War II into apartments. That was very common in Midtown, and were owned by absentee landlords. And in the 1970s, people started moving back into the Midtown neighborhoods, rehabbing the houses and turning them back into single family use. But we continued to have a lot of landlords that, for instance, the house next to mine was 5 apartments, not legally, but it was 5 apartments. People were constantly moving in and out, and that's why we downzoned our neighborhood. It's like I said, it's made a huge difference, and I wouldn't have any concern about my neighbor having an accessory unit in building 1 in their backyard for their mother-in-law to live in or for their kids to live in. My concern is that we're being inundated with Airbnbs in this part of town. And I just see the Airbnb owners as seeing this as a really good thing. They could cram some more units onto their property. A lot of them are, you know, have turned into party houses. We have no control over them. And, you know, we want to live in neighborhoods where people are invested in the neighborhood. So I looked a little bit at the American Planning Association website today, and it seems like in some places they're, well, like Kevin said, there are some restrictions that they can't be rented to non-family members. I don't know how it's workable if you would build, my neighbor would build one for their mother-in-law, and then they would sell their house to somebody who lives in California. You know, it seems like we then lose control. So I think that would be a big concern in my neighborhood.
I think, and to tag on Nola, because the ministry that she's referring to, I think the biggest complaint we've heard is parking. We have people come and go, but usually it's in 3 to 6 month segments. It's, but I think that if you had something in your backyard, then you need to accommodate off-street parking for those people. Because then when you have people over on top of it, it's just too much for the neighborhood. I haven't seen the coming and going of people be a problem, but maybe it's just, you know, this is a ministry, and so there's a higher expectation. But I also think that you can make rules that don't allow short-term anything less than 3 to 6 months or 3 months or whatever. That would eliminate some of the traffic maybe that you were just talking about, Mary Jo. I don't know if that would do it, or what are you saying?
Yeah, I think the issue regarding short-term rentals, many cities have kind of addressed that separately and have done that effectively. I know, for instance, you said, Kevin, you had Santa Fe, New Mexico up there, and they have obviously a very tourist type of population, and they have very rigid boundaries on where you can and cannot have short-term rentals. So that can be controlled, and the city is still trying to get their handle around being able to do that more effectively. If that becomes an issue, our experience here in Central Hyde Park in our neighborhood, as was mentioned earlier, is a little unique because even though we're a single family residential neighborhood, we are allowed to rent either an attic space or a carriage house to an unrelated person in our neighborhood. That was something that Donna had experienced probably in the 80s, maybe. And there's actually very little complaint on our block of any of the tenants that are in those units. Very little. The one complaint may be going back to the parking issue. If somebody has a heartburn of people wanting to park on the street versus having to park in the rear of their lots. I think we only have one, perhaps, resident that was successful in arguing that their short-term rental was grandfathered. And I don't know how that came down, but apparently it was a short-term rental before that particular ordinance went into place a couple, 2 years ago. So, and there's been very little issues with that as well. So I think the perception of having, let's say, an unrelated quote tenant on a single family lot is really something that, you know, we just need to look at how it's codified in other cities to make sure that it's done properly. And part of that, I think, comes back to how property maintenance is policed. And I'm not so sure that the neighborhood housing authority is probably as diligent as they are in that. And that's, again, a separate issue.
I can share something real quick to add on to what you said, Eric. Currently, right now, and I got this directly from the city planning staff, a person can have what is shared housing. They can have up to 5 unrelated people in a house on 5 different leases already today. And so what we're experiencing in my neighborhood, and again, I'm in Red Bridge, is just right across the street, someone bought a house and they are doing that. So we're just in the beginning of seeing how that works and how that's going to look with cars. But as of today, that is already allowed in our city. And I think the only difference, Kevin, I think I asked you the difference between shared housing where you could have 5 unrelated people and an accessory dwelling unit where maybe you have 1 or 2, is I think you said the kitchen, having a private kitchen in the unit.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And everyone else in the shared housing, they share the kitchen in common areas, but that's already allowed. And so is this any worse or any different than that would be, you know, a question that I would have because it exists.
And of course, the other thing that you see in historic neighborhoods is the desire of some residents wanting to convert their historic home to a bed and breakfast to whatever capacity. And so that parking becomes an issue there, usually more. But this is, to me, just a more amenable solution for allowing more affordable housing types in the in the Midtown area or in the city, plus a way of helping offset, as Kevin mentioned, revenue expenses for somebody who's trying to take on a project, whether it's a restoration of a historic home or to build a new infill house on the city lot.
And what else? What are other, go ahead. Sorry.
I just had a question. Is the idea that you would try to do this just in Midtown or in all of Kansas City or in the whole region?
Probably we would just start with an area of Kansas City, Missouri that made logical sense, you know, and I don't have a great definition for that right now, Mary Jo. I would say probably, you know, loosely speaking, like all of the part of the city that was originally built before like 1940, because those were all the neighborhoods where these were common. So that is, you know, most of the urban core south of the river, from State Line to Blue River and down to probably the Waldo area. But there might be other places where it would be appropriate too, where if people are interested. And I think we need to find a way, we need to figure out a way to have a test area that is large enough where it actually could work, but small, you know, enough of an area that it's not the entire city. We're not trying to bite off the whole city at once.
I wanted to tag on a little bit, but I think I heard you say, Mary Jo, around stabilizing neighborhoods. I lived in Midtown and Hyde Park for about 15 years, and I definitely heard, you know, those arguments. I guess I want to offer an alternative take, especially for the urban core, that like in the 5th district and areas east of Troost, where there is so much turnover and people moving in and out, and older people in those communities and families want to stay and invest in that community, but they feel either they've outgrown their house, or I mean, their house has outgrown them rather, and they can't afford to stay there, and they would really prefer to stay there but be with their families. And so I do feel like, you know, from the point of view of looking at some of the urban school districts where we know families have been so transient and not been able to put down roots because of lack of affordable housing for one issue, but in others, you know, families would be able to stay and welcome their grandkids. They can move, you know, let the grandkids and their kids have the house, they move in the ADU. So I would really encourage everyone to think about it that way as well, is that it's a way to stabilize a community. And I think that's really what we've seen from a lot of the case studies that we've shared from AARP, is that allowing people to age in place and to stay and invest in communities where there has been a lot of turnover is a benefit. So
I agree with that, Laura. And a lot of people, like in our neighborhoods, I'm in the 64114 zip code, when they move, when they are out of their home because they don't need a big home anymore because they're older and they want to downsize, the majority of them want to stay in their same communities. And this allows them an option to stay in their same communities and potentially in their own homes. And so I think it's great for seniors and keeping neighborhoods stabilized. And then to follow up, if I could, Angie put something in, you're in Waldo, about, you know, making maybe the ordinance citywide neighborhoods can opt out. I think one of the things that our goal is, and Kevin, Laura, and I, we've called like a lot of neighborhoods and we're actually talking to them. Our goal would be to get neighborhoods that want to be a part of it, instead of people having to fight to get out, to identify neighborhoods who said, hey, I think that's great for my neighborhood, or it sounds good. We want to work more collaboratively. And we don't want neighborhoods to have to rise up when an ordinance comes through and having to fight against something. We'd rather support something than fighting against it. And that's kind of our strategy here, is to find out who wants to be involved in what neighborhoods, you know, see as a positive. And then the next step beyond that, and we have, is he gone? One of our council members is just,
Yeah,
he just left. One of our things is that we want them to create an ordinance to be created from the beginning that can be supported, and that it's us saying this is what we want and not something being forced on us that we have to respond to or fight against.
right. It looked like
Thank
Kayla.
you.
Kayla, were you? Sorry.
I'll pop in with I'm like in between games with the kids, but I just want to thank you for that. And I think that I'm just thinking like of in the terms of zones, creating certain zones, and you know, how difficult it is to have like an overlay over the city to actually create those boundaries. And I'm just thinking logistically, you know, what's easier to do, but I'm supportive of that. And I think that overall our board has expressed support for this idea.
Thank you.
And you're one of the largest in the city, I think, if not the largest, with over 3,000 homes represented under the umbrella of your association. So I think that is a big deal.
Yeah, it's 3,300, I think.
Right. So that's great.
Kayla, you're next.
Hi, thanks, Kevin. I have a few perspectives. I live in the Volker neighborhood. We are primarily renters. We have over 70% renters, and we have a wide variety of buildings. We have huge apartment complexes that are owned by corporations. We have single family homes. We have, I'm sure, some ADUs that I've seen, but I'm not really sure if they're being used that way. And everything in between. And we also downzoned. I remember the Volker Neighborhood Association downzoning a few years ago. I would say that hasn't necessarily preserved the integrity or the character or of the neighborhood from my perspective. I rent in a fourplex that's over 100 years old. And my building was owned locally by a local owner for over 40 years, and he sold recently to an international investor. And so that was a big change for me because I lived in my building for 10 years. I am active in my community and my neighborhood association. I run our community garden. I'm friends with all the people here. I work in the neighborhood too. And so they are trying to now cram like 2 little studio apartments in the very old basement, which I don't, but that person doesn't have a lot of, he's actually never even been in the building. And so even with that zoning and all of that in place, that hasn't really prevented someone from outside from making kind of sort of drastic changes to the homes. Also, I'm here because I'm interested in purchasing a home at some point in Kansas City, Missouri, and I would like to have this as an option. Someone mentioned, special needs, but I am a caretaker for an adult with a disability. And the way disability works, which AARP, you're probably aware of this, but people who are in particular on SSI make a low income, and their housing has to be separate from anyone else to keep their benefit. And so it's actually quite difficult, even if you were to receive what was formerly Section 8 housing choice voucher, to find a place that you could afford in the neighborhood that's walkable, where you don't have to also have a car. So for me, living in the neighborhood I do, with lots of renters, lots of historic buildings, lots of people who really care for each other, it has a high walkability score. I could see this being, certainly we are also experiencing the Airbnb issues. We're experiencing all kinds of different gentrification and those kinds of things, but I would advocate for it with the kind of restrictions that Mary Jo, you're talking about, with somehow having accountability around short-term rentals and all that. So that's just my personal experience story that I hope will frame a very real person trying to navigate this type of housing in the real world. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Other comments or questions? It looks like Laura's got her hand up. Look at her. She's actually
Trying to be. I just wanted, Southmoreland has a huge variety of housing types. We have multifamily apartments, we have huge mansions, and then small houses, and some of those are owned and some of those are rented. And we've actually, a couple years ago, had something come along where it was a carriage house and the new owner wanted to be able to rent it out, and we couldn't get it approved. They couldn't get it approved even with our neighborhood supporting it, which was kind of disappointing. And so there's some of these houses that are so large, and when they come up on the market, it's really hard to find someone to buy it because it's just so much, but they all come with carriage houses. And if we could find a way to make those, to kind of offset the cost of ownership by being able to rent out the carriage house and the living quarters, it makes it a lot more manageable, and people might consider that more. So I think our neighborhood would be open to something like this with, some definitions. I don't think chopping up a single family home is something that we would like to see, but the unit over a garage or an addition or something like that specifically would be welcome in our neighborhood. It's right on the streetcar line, and people want to be able to stay in the neighborhood, and the costs of living here are going up. If there's some way we can find to meet people where they are and be able to stay in the neighborhood, that would be great.
great. Thanks, Laura. Randy.
Hi there. Sorry, I joined the meeting a little late. I just wanted to add, so I'm on the KCMO Board of Zoning Adjustment, And we've actually seen quite a few of these come before us in the last year of people wanting to do these to their homes and not realizing that it's not possible. So they're really devastated that I wanted to build this for my in-laws and they just can't do the project. So I think there is interest in various parts of the city. And I think I don't think it'd be an overwhelming number of these. I saw Mary Jo's comment. I don't know, maybe more people than I think would be interested in pursuing this, but I think there is interest. And I think the more we can kind of help promote this infill, the better in our city, especially if people have the land and the want to do it. It would be just great to do it. Myself, we would like to build a garage with one if it was allowed, but maybe if we wait long enough, that'll be the case and it'll all work out, but see what happens.
So Randy, I have a question for you. So when people come before the BZA in order to do this, which like you said, isn't allowed, but then they come with the short-term rentals, what kind of reaction do you see? Do you see a lot of the neighbors coming out against it, or what kind of, how do you gauge neighborhood reaction to those?
So it definitely varies. So a lot of the ones that we've had that come before us for an ADU in particular, there's usually been support from the neighbors and everyone's kind of shocked that it's not allowed. The short-term rentals has definitely been a different kind of beast. So in today's BZA hearing alone, I think we had 7 short-term rental applications or cases come before us today. And I think there were 2 or 3 of those 7 that had significant opposition. So we denied those cases because the neighbors had spoken up and reported 311 that there had been issues. And, we as the board then choose that that's not the best fit for the neighborhood and adjust as necessary. So I think it's really how communicative the person has been with the neighborhood. A lot of these people, they know the neighbors, they know, who's around the properties they're renting, they check on the properties often. I think it's building that relationship. And if this ADU situation, if there's a situation where you could do it that if you're the owner of the property, you need to live on the property to operate an ADU or something like that, that would have that accountability and have that just reinforcement that I don't think would cause some of the short-term rentals that we're seeing when people do live in other parts of the city or out in the suburbs and are kind of running some of these different buildings in the downtown area.
What trends do you see, either neighborhoods that like it or don't like it? What trends do you see? Because that could be telling, I think, for the ADUs as well.
Most of them have been really on board. I wouldn't say that there's a particular area of the city that has been for or against it. Most of the cases today were kind of in the Longfellow neighborhood and then down south by Redbridge. Those just happened to be the cases that came before us. And there's 3 of them in one kind of neighborhood within a 10-block radius. 3 of them owned by the same individual. 2 of the units had good reviews. There was no complaints, but one of them had a ton of complaints. All run by the same person in the same neighborhood. The one that had a lot of complaints had 8 bedrooms. So the issue they had there is that even though on Airbnb you can have a maximum of 8 guests, they were having more than that. And there was issues with 35 people being on site and 12 cars. And so that's where that became an issue. So I think that where ADUs have a benefit is that they're going to be smaller. You're not going to have, most likely, unless there's a really giant house, of course, you're not going to have 15 people in this place. You're going to have a couple. And I don't think it's going to kind of correlate the same or have the same issues necessarily.
Okay, your insight was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it really seems like in most cities, it's the whole house short-term rentals that are the ones that really cause the most heartburn. In my time in Savannah, which is another historic city that's a major tourist destination, it was an incredible issue. Literally fought about it for 5 years and wrote 2 different ordinances to deal with it. And a lot of that was going towards effectively trying to restrict the large party houses because it's frankly, it's just really hard to manage those. It's hard to, from a city perspective, it's hard to figure out how to regulate and actually stay on top of those situations. It's almost impossible. So interesting. Thanks, Randy. That's great background.
It is.
Donna, did you want to add any background on?
Yeah, you see me fidgeting here. And there's a lot to cover. It's not a simple discussion. Yeah. We have to look back at what caused some of the deterioration in the housing to begin with, especially in the Midtown area. My experiences with the Midtown area is not with the other the suburbs. So it was after World War II that, or during World War II, that most of the housing that didn't have the restrictions on it became apartments. And it was a large part of the city east of Troost, and some of it west of Troost. And when I moved into my property, and it's been 40 some plus years, in my block, every house on my block was apartments. Now, about 4 of them or 5 of them were owner occupied apartments, but they were all apartments. They were deteriorated. The whole neighborhood was that way. And that's what you saw with the Midtown neighborhoods, a deterioration because of the conversion to apartments and the lack of owner occupancy. What turned it around was when, and especially in Hyde Park, which is my personal experience, was when Federal Home Savings came in and said that they would pay to do rehab on the houses. So you could get a loan that would help pay you put in a kitchen and a bathroom and you convert the housing. That's what helped start turning the neighborhood around. So we're very concerned about the impact of not having owner occupied in the housing. Our lots are narrow. A lot of the lots in South Hyde Park and North Hyde Park are only 25 feet wide. So there's not enough, a lot of room to do an accessory structure. And the other houses, even with 50-foot wide, it's not that deep to do a separate accessory structure. So that's where my experience comes from, is what it took to bring the neighborhood back. Because the people came in and did the conversions back to single family is what made this a desirable neighborhood. Is what made Armour turn around. Armour and Mac Properties would not be here if we hadn't turned the single family housing around. And when you look at this, the other issue inside of this is density. The densest census tract in Kansas City, Missouri is part of Armour Boulevard. So when you look at the Midtown area, density and rental versus home occupied, and it's not a matter of being just single family. When you really look at Hyde Park, and again, my experience was with Hyde Park, there are a lot of duplexes, original housing built as duplexes. There are a lot of apartments. When you look at the census data in 2010, I would say like 60%, 50% of the housing were single family. The rest of them were apartments, even not including Armour. Armour census tract ran from 36th Street to 34th Street. So when you looked at south of 36th Street, it was a good blend of options for housing. So that is one thing. And so that's where we came from. And it took us a long time to go through the down zoning. So when we went through the carriage house issue, which Steve Mitchell was one of the big people pushing that, the issue was increasing the density when we'd already fought to reduce it, even though we have a variety of housing options. There's 1950 housings, 1950 duplexes, there's 60 duplexes, there's all kinds of duplexes and single family housing in the area. Then that was the one big driving force that was raised an issue during the carriage house back in, I don't remember what the time frame was. I've been here too long. And I couldn't find my disc that had all the information on it. Is that was the issue, is that we had to focus on, you can't change the balance between residential and owner occupied. When we looked at the census data, I did a census data study in 2010 census data, looking at east of Troost and west of Troost, between the Paseo and Prospect and over to Main Street, and looked at it. And one of the biggest issue was owner occupied. And how can we increase that owner occupied ratio, and also who was living there? So that's one of the reasons why when we did the zoning ordinance change, that what we worked out for finally was that the house could have an accessory use and another use in the house. So a big property could have 3 units in it if it was owner occupied, and at least one of the units was a relative. So that was where the compromise came out back then. Now, I was in on the BCA hearing today. Thank you, Randy, for staying there the whole time. I looked at, that was one of the concerns I looked at, was the short-term rental. And what I saw was some of the short-term rental was in multiple unit buildings. But we were very concerned about what's happening with the short-term rental, with the Airbnb, and with the new deal with major national real estate businesses coming in and purchasing up single family housing to rent. And if you looked at, I went and looked at the single family housing rental current information, there was a huge number of rental users in West Plaza. So that threw a red flag up that we may have a concern here later on with single family housing owner occupied in West Plaza area. It's also showing up in a couple of pods east of Troost. So that's a couple of things. Like, again, there's a whole lot of areas to cover. I don't believe you can do a general zoning that allows it across the board. Each neighborhood is unique. And I really support what Mary Jo Draper's talked about in each neighborhood. There are challenges, and I don't know what the mix is, but it has, it's a challenge. It is a big challenge, and I'll stop there. If you have any questions for me, I will try to remember what we went through. And I wasn't able to find up my disc that had all my information on it.
If I have a quick follow-up for you, are you saying that if, like, when lenders or a lender made financing available for owners to renovate their own properties, that was a negative or it was a positive because it got them to convert back to just an owner occupant single family structure without rentals in it? Is that what you were saying?
I'm saying it was a very big positive because they not only gave you the financial to buy the house, they gave you the financial to redo the kitchen, build the garage, or add a refinish the bathroom, because they provided that additional money that you needed to bring the house up to existing standards. There were 13 people living in my house when I bought it. There were 3 people in the basement, 2 people on the first floor, 3 people on the 3rd floor, and the one apartment on the 4th floor had about the size of a closet. So that was a very big positive in being able to do that. Now, I will tell you that there are, I'm thinking there are 3 accessory apartments on my block that are illegal, but we're not going to turn them in, and I won't tell you who they are, but they're over the garages that are not grandfathered in. But there is a tipping point where do you have too many of those? And then we're also going to be hitting up with the parking issue that comes with MAC Properties when they continue their project at Armour and Troost, because that's going to add another 100 cars looking for parking places on Harrison, Troost, and Forest, and Tracy, and on over. So it is going to be a huge issue that's going to have another negative impact on the neighborhood.
Okay, thank you.
You know, one perception I'd like to add, Kevin, is it seems to me that we'll continue to see more conversions of what went through Donna's experience in the 70s and the 80s from a apartment building or a house that's been converted to apartments that perhaps somebody wants to convert back to a single family house, but doesn't quite have the wherewithal to do the restoration while they purchased it, if they have the additional revenue stream of a accessory dwelling unit. So, you know, it makes sense to me that if the caveat is that it has to be owner occupied, it could actually incentivize the continued rehabilitation of neighborhoods from converting perhaps some of Volker back to single family with a separate income stream and a separate dwelling unit.
And-
I
yeah.
did want to ask one other thing though, Kevin, and then I'll stop. The 1940s kind of demarcation you were thinking about as a way of starting with certain geographic locations. That maybe kind of ties into the different housing types and patterns that we saw in post-World War II housing, where you've got really limited access to the rear yard with ranches or Cape Cods on smaller lots that you really can't put a garage unless you had an alley, and they didn't have alleys. So is that kind of your thinking there on the time frame on that in terms of the vintage?
Yeah,
of the-
I think that's part of it. There was just obviously a real break in how houses were built pre World War II versus post World War II, and that pattern is pretty obvious to most of us when you go around the city. So, picking, and plus we had, in Kansas City, Missouri, the city limits, were established and expanded at different dates. And there was a 1940, I think, was one limit expansion before it expanded again in maybe 1950 or something like that. But
And may I also say that when we're looking at the housing that's approaching 90 and 100 years old, it's expensive to maintain them. There is a lot of upkeep on them. So there's a challenge that will put more pressure on people to try to convert them back to more units.
Yeah.
And so that's it's hard. It's, neighborhoods go in cycles.
Yep.
And we hope that this cycle continues to be positive and provides positive housing for a variety of renters and owner occupied.
Yep. Well, I think that background on how we got to where we are today, and the good, the bad, and the ugly of everything that happened is really important, and we need to not lose sight of why a lot of these neighborhoods went into decline originally.
Well, it's very interesting. I just read a book, and I will not remember the author's name, but it was Race, Real Estate, and Development in Kansas City, and his last name was Gotham, Gatham. Kevin. And it's a very interesting book on how the real estate developers are the ones. I'm going to just digress here a little bit. I thought the neighborhoods east of Troost were hollowed out more with the white migration occurred after the riots in the 60s. But it started before then by the developers in the suburbs telling people that they needed a bigger yard, that they needed a better school, that they needed this and that. And then it was the real estate developers that really helped started the migration well before the 60s. It was a very interesting read to see how that impacted the neighborhoods, and that it was driven by things that had nothing to do with the housing stock.
Well, it looks like we're getting some people starting to drop off. Are there any, before we sign off, any burning final questions or comments somebody wants to get in?
I do want to mention that as we wrap up, that the coalition, and I don't want to speak for you, Kevin, but I think we've talked about this with Stacy, that we're in for talking with individual neighborhoods, and we'll probably do more of these, right? So hopefully as you think about this and you get more questions, you'll keep an open mind and encourage people to participate in the process in the coming months.
And then if anyone has any, if I can add to that, if you think that you generally support it and know that we're trying to present it in such a way that it is for people who want, neighborhoods that want to be engaged in it, if you have any suggestions or ideas for us, we welcome that too. And again, the coalition is open to other people joining us. So if anyone here says, hey, I'm interested in this, that you're welcome to join our coalition as well, or your neighborhood, whatever you need. We're open to ideas and thoughts.
Great. Many times just having a very clear, succinct communication of the idea is really important. PR. It was one of the things that if we could have done that 20 years ago in this neighborhood, it would have saved a lot of arguing. And, so some of the people that have moved in and done like multi-generational or roommate situations have really been assets to the community, and have effectively replaced, some of the bad examples that all of us want to avoid of, some out-of-state rental property owner who rents it to whoever, tears up the neighborhood. So I think some good PR and some clear communication on some of these ideas are very helpful. Our area, it's a lot of homes that were built as tract homes in the 50s and 60s. And so it can be a big help to have some clear communication on this. And so I'll look forward to the recording and other times when you'll be articulating this idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nola. Dennis? Dennis Strait?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you unmute
sorry.
because you wanted to say something? And if not, I'd be curious
was
to hear your observations anyway.
Well, for one thing, I love this conversation, and it's an impressive group got on the call to have this discussion. A lot of important things have been said, including, Donna's comment about recent phenomenon about corporate residential purchases. That's the most recent threat to our affordability in Kansas City is people are scarping up all the affordable homes and they're going to be putting them in portfolios. And the next thing you know, owner occupied will sound quaint compared to the problems we have. So I'm glad we're all talking about this. I hope more of us will talk about this and try and find solutions like you all are seeking. It is a complicated situation, and yes, the developers played a role, but so did the federal government and a lot of other entities over the last 75 years. And we're now trying to untangle all of that and get back to a place where we can have both livable and affordable and diverse communities that give opportunity to many more people than we've given opportunity to in the past. So again, I just admire the group that came together and the fact that you're having this discussion. I feel like it was a match class, and I hope we have more of them.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know what? I like that between Dennis and Donna focusing on that. Again, as a real estate agent and as an investor, we are seeing that single family homes, the one across the street from me was purchased by an investor, a corporate investor to rent out. And it's happening across our whole city in all neighborhoods. And so that is limiting some of the housing that's available for either first time buyers or people who want to own homes. We already had a shortage of it, but now you're having a family having to compete with a corporate investor that can pay cash well over the listing price for the home. So home ownership is in danger. And that is something I think another angle, Laura and Kevin, that we can look at too as a way to preserve single family ownership by owner occupants. I think that's real important to say. And with a lot of landlords or small housing providers who may own single family homes locally and feeling the effects of the pandemic, the CDC eviction moratorium, where many of them may not have collected rent for months. And some of them haven't been able to collect rent for over a year. They're feeling the strain and the pressure. And if they get someone knocking on their door saying, hey, I'll buy your home, they're going to sell it. And so we're losing in that way too. So we need to keep making it attractive for local owners to keep their properties. And policy is important, as we can see from that eviction moratorium. It's important. So I'm glad we're doing what we're doing. And I echo Kevin and Laura, thanking those of you who are on the call with us today. And we will do more and hear from more people. And if you know someone else that needs to be included in the next one, please just let us know. We're going to keep going.
I'll send out to all the attendees, but this was recorded as well. So we'll be able to share the recording if there's somebody you'd like to share it with. Okay.
Kevin, I wanted to mention one last thing. Mary Jo Draper and myself are on the Historic Kansas City Executive Board. And one of the big goals of our organization is the preservation not only of buildings in the Kansas City metro area, but the preservation of its neighborhoods. And so, how we do that, what vehicles and mechanisms we use, you've all been part of some of the conversations we've had over the last few years, but we'll be bringing this to the board just to continue to open the dialogue up And so your organization will certainly be hearing from us and have a chance to participate in future dialogues.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric.
Sure.
All right, we'll wrap it here, but I really appreciate everybody's time. Great comments, great discussion, and we will try to keep everybody posted on any next steps. And like I said, I'll share the recording with everybody who registered with the Eventbrite. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Evening.
Thanks.